are at a constant risk of being sued, even when we abide by all the rules.
This bill would allow these very businesses to walk away without any consequences. It would take away one of the only forms of justice survivors have left.
That was just some of the reactions that are reverberating at the Georgia State Capitol as judicial reform and lawsuit reform continue making its way through this session of the Georgia General Assembly. And that is one of our leading stories here on today's edition of Political Update from Atlanta News First for Wednesday, March 19th, 2025. I'm Tim Darnell, joined by my friend and colleague, Rick Folbaum. And before we get into our discussion about what lawsuit reform and judicial reform is all about, we had this excellent piece from our political reporter, Doug Reardon, talking about tort reform and how it really impacts all of Georgians and breaking down some of the most complex issues of what has become one of Governor Brian Kemp's top legislative priorities. Here is that story, and we'll come back in just a few minutes to talk about it a little bit more.
Businesses say they're taking the brunt of a system that makes it too easy to sue them. Others say they need the civil justice system intact so they can seek justice themselves. We talked to a lot of business owners who say lawsuits are so prevalent in Georgia, it's become easier to settle the cases than to take them to court. The problem is that makes insurance premiums go up, and businesses say they are unable to afford it. This bill would take some of the liability off businesses when things happen on their property. Less lawsuits, lawmakers hope, means insurance rates balance out. But some people aren't happy with the bills. Sexual assault and elder abuse survivors say that they should be able to freely sue places like hotels that were party to trafficking or nursing homes who take advantage of patients on their property. It is a very sticky mix of consequences.
If something happened at your house, in your yard, that you had nothing to do with, do you think you should be brought into a lawsuit because of that? We had one year where we had 2 letters for $400,000 apiece. I mean, that will put a company out of business.
Opponents also point out there's nothing in these bills that would require insurers to lower their rates. Businesses just hope that if more providers come back to Georgia, the competition will lower the rates naturally.
Rick, I think the first time that I remember hearing the word tort or tort reform was when I was reading one of John Grisham's best-selling novels, The King of Torts. This is an issue that is very complex, and we use the phrase tort reform. We've heard Brian Kemp use the phrase tort reform. It's really all about civil litigation reform and lawsuit reform. Break it down a little bit more for us and how this issue can really impact everyone in Georgia.
That's right. Well, the civil system is the way that people who have been harmed or who believe that they have been harmed, that they can go after the person or the business that they feel is responsible for that in order to recover damages that might help to pay for their medical expenses, for example, or their time away from work, for example. And so this is a part of our system. It is a legitimate part of our system that no one is proposing should go away. But as Governor Kemp has said, it really does have a trickle-down effect when you see these frivolous lawsuits, these lawsuits that are brought against businesses and companies. And what happens here, and we heard part of this in Doug's report, is it drives up the cost of insurance that these companies then have to pay to protect themselves against these types of lawsuits. And it also then those costs then get passed on to consumers in any number of ways. And so the goal, the idea of tort reform, of getting rid of these frivolous lawsuits, is something that I think a lot of people, if you just take a step back, you can understand why that would be a priority for Governor Kemp, why it would be a priority for state lawmakers. But the flip side is that a lot of people who have been wronged, legitimately wronged, and who want to be able to recover some type of financial settlement for their damages, they need to have that system in place in order to be able to go through that process and to have it adjudicated through the judicial system. And so that's really the competing issues here, is that on the one hand, the need to get rid of frivolous lawsuits that have a a negative impact on so many people, not just the businesses, but also the consumer that has those costs again passed down to them. But then also the need to protect the interests of people who are legitimately victimized or injured in some way, shape, or form, that they should have the ability to go after those responsible to get some kind of compensation for what they've been through. And so you hear from these victims groups, especially when it comes to sex trafficking, for example.
And they're heartbreaking.
They're heartbreaking stories, and you hear these people, and you can only imagine, most of us can only imagine what they've been through, and the ordeals that they've been through, and for them to be under the belief that perhaps a hotel where these crimes were allegedly taking place, that the hotel, the people that run or own the hotel were aware of these crimes and yet looked the other way and allowed them to take place. Again, you take a step back and you say, well, sure, that hotel owner should be held responsible for not stepping in and stopping this potentially before it happened. And so, again, it's the kind of thing where you really can see both sides. And I think that's sort of the line that lawmakers are trying to toe here, is to figure out exactly what is appropriate and what is inappropriate. What would go too far and that would prevent these victims from actually being able to receive compensation for the damages that they've incurred.
Well, before this session of the General Assembly got underway, we heard from Governor Brian Kemp, who said this is a major legislative priority of his administration. And he has said that if the General Assembly does not adopt some sort of lawsuit or judicial reform, civil liability lawsuit reform, then he is perhaps looking at calling lawmakers back for a special session. And I'm sure that's something no lawmaker would actually look forward to. We have also heard from parents of children who were allegedly abused at daycare centers, and they feel like if a lawsuit reform package does pass, that would also cut off an avenue for them to seek damages as well. As you said, on the flip side, we have the insurance industry and personal injury attorneys who don't want any potential source of income or restitution to be prohibited from their pursuit. So this issue has long-standing ramifications for literally everyone.
I mean, just an example here, we think about these frivolous lawsuits or these outrageous lawsuits. We had a story in the news this week about a guy who was burned at a Starbucks drive-through. This was not in Georgia, but again, I use it just to sort of illustrate the situation here, is that this is someone who was legitimately injured, but who is suing now for $50 million against Starbucks, trying to recover $50 million, which is not to say that he doesn't deserve any kind of compensation for his injuries, but it is maybe to show and to really sort of lay out exactly how some of these lawsuits that might begin as being well-intentioned, then you get these trial attorneys who come on board and who say, well, let's not go for $50,000 or $500,000, let's go for the whole kit and caboodle. And so that really, you see how these civil cases can get ramped up to the point where, then all of a sudden you're talking about somebody collecting, a lot of money for a legitimate injury, but is that injury really, costing him or her the amount of money that they're trying to recover from the company?
Well, this is a priority, as we said, of Governor Brian Kemp, who also was in the news earlier this week when he asked the officials from the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, ICE, commonly known, to provide training to state law enforcement officers, presumably troopers under the Georgia State Patrol, to offer training in immigration enforcement. We are all aware of President Donald Trump's deportation of several hundred members, alleged members of a notorious Venezuelan criminal street gang who were deported roughly about the same time as a federal judge was ordering those deportations to stop. And that has led to kind of a judicial conundrum for the administration and Donald Trump's advocates who are in favor of mass deportations of people who are here illegally who may or may not be guilty of committing criminal activities. But Governor Brian Kemp has gotten on board and he's asking immigrations and customs enforcement officials to offer training to state law enforcement. Tell us a little bit more about what that's about.
Well, I would think that this is something that we're going to be seeing across the country now as governors and local law enforcement around the country is being asked to perform a lot of these jobs that were formerly, the role of federal agents to come in and conduct these raids and identify these people who might potentially be a threat to the general public. The governor saying here in Georgia that that state troopers here in Georgia are not trained, at least not yet, in how to perform these tasks, and that if you're going to be asking local law enforcement, state law enforcement to play that role, then you've got to come in and train them. And so it does seem as though there is going to be some kind of a cooperative agreement between federal agencies and also state agencies here in Georgia to try to provide that training again, because, and again, this is not passing any judgment on the policies that have been put in place by the new Trump administration, but they have promised, and President Trump campaigned on a promise to deport illegal aliens, especially those who may pose a risk to the general public here. Of course, we have the Lake and Riley Act that was named for the Georgia nursing student who was killed by someone who was here in the country illegally. And so that's really what we're talking about here. And Governor Kemp is saying, look, we want to help out in these efforts. We want our state law enforcement officers to be able to play a role here, but we're going to need to give them the training that they need so that they can do this in an effective and legal manner. And so that's what Governor Kemp is asking for. And like I said, I think this is something that a lot of other governors around the country, as they begin to understand exactly what's going to be asked of state law enforcement, that a lot of other governors are going to be asking for the same type of thing.
Over the past several weeks, we've seen a lot of demonstrations and rallies protesting these deportations. But from your standpoint, does it seem like the opposition to these mass deportations is kind of leveling off a little bit? Perhaps it's just me, but I don't see the level of intensity over the past couple of weeks. And from a purely political standpoint, how can you not be against deportations of members of supposedly a violent criminal street gang who, again, if you believe the allegations and charges, are behind some pretty violent and heinous acts here in the United States? How can you not be against that kind of a measure?
Well, I think that most reasonable people are not against the idea, at least on the face of it, of getting rid of people who, A, are here illegally, and B, who pose a threat to the general public. I think that people who are protesting are those who are afraid that innocent people are going to get swept up in all of this. What's the famous line from Casablanca? Round up the usual suspects. That in these raids, that there are going to be people who are going to be included in these raids when they shouldn't be. And then all of a sudden you're going to see them face these kinds of deportation and other types of procedures. There is a college student in New York whose name escapes me right now. Khalil, I think, is his first name, who was a part of planning the student protests. These were the pro-Palestinian protest that took place on the campus of Columbia University in New York City last year, when all those campus protests were taking place. The Trump administration saying that this is someone who broke the law and who needs to be deported. And now there is this sort of coming together of different groups of people that you wouldn't normally think would be aligned, but who are saying, look, this is somebody who was in the country legally. He had permanent green card status. It wasn't as though he had broken the law as far as being here. And he was exercising his First Amendment rights as somebody who was here in this country to be able to protest peacefully. Now, you can agree or disagree with his cause, but again, if you were to take a step back, do we really want to see people who may have a controversial point of view, but who are here in this country legally? Do we want to see them swept up in these raids and facing deportation as a result of that? And I think that's the question that's sort of hanging out there: is how far should this go, and what happens if people who are not breaking the law get swept up in it?
Well, the other issue that we're talking about on this edition of Political Update for Wednesday, March 19th, 2025, an issue that has been percolating for some years now, and that is Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis's alleged election interference indictment of Donald Trump and more than a dozen of his Republican allies this week. Fulton County Superior Court Judge Rachel Krause ordered DA Fani Willis's office to pay more than $54,000 in attorney's fees to Ashley Merchant. Ashley Merchant is the principal of a Marietta-based law firm, and she was the representative or the advocate or the attorney, I should say, for one of those co-defendants, that being Michael Roman. Ashley Merchant first brought to light the romantic relationship between Fulton County DA Fani Willis and a former special prosecutor she had hired to assist in her investigation and subsequent indictment of the then former president. This was in August of 2021, Nathan Wade. Now, Ashley Merchant has been pressuring the DA's office to release a number of public records that she had made through the Open Records Act here in the state of Georgia, relating to how much money the DA's office had spent in their investigation of Donald Trump in relation to a alleged election interference indictment dating back to Georgia's 2020 presidential election results. This past week, Fulton County Superior Court judge ordered the DA's office to pay, as I said, more than $54,000 in attorney's fees to Ashley Merchant. Rick, this is a case that is currently, I believe, still before the Georgia Court of Appeals, or maybe making its way to the Georgia Supreme Court. It was a huge historic indictment when it was handed down several years ago, but now this entire case has just really stalled, and it may actually go away.
I can't imagine this having blown up any more so in the face of Fulton County DA Fani Willis, who for a while was championed by the left, championed by Democrats for her pursuit of then former President Trump and the allegations that he and co-conspirators, and 19 of them, I believe, he and his allies here in Georgia worked behind the scenes to try to overturn the election results from 2020, when Joe Biden won the state of Georgia by a very slim margin, despite the fact that there were allegations of fraud. Those allegations were never proved, and Joe Biden won the state legitimately, but Fani Willis and her team decided to go after the former president, now current president, and it really just has gone haywire on her now, to the point where she's being told that she has to fork over this $54,000 legal fee fund, and of course this is absolutely amazing news for President Trump and his allies, who, of course, have viewed this case as a quote unquote witch hunt from the start. And to now see this all sort of fly back into Fani Willis's face must be very gratifying for them as they watch all of this play out here in Georgia.
Well, it will continue to play out. We have had extensive coverage of this historic indictment since it was handed down, and we'll continue to follow this issue and many others. Final word regarding some of the other headlines we're following here on Atlanta News First and AtlantaNewsFirst.com. Earlier this week, Governor Brian Kemp appointed Barbara Rivera Holmes to be the state's new labor commissioner. She will finish out the term initially being filled out by Bruce Thompson, the former labor commissioner who passed away last year due to cancer. Ms. Rivera Holmes is the first woman of Hispanic descent to hold a statewide office here in the state of Georgia, joining John King, who is the current Insurance and Fire Commissioner, as the state's very first Hispanic elected official elected to a statewide office. So we imagine that she will possibly seek the full term next year in the 2026 wide open Georgia statewide elections. Also encouraging everyone to continue to follow our updates as lawsuit reform, judicial reform makes its way through the General Assembly. One thing we did not mention is that a State House of Representatives vote is expected possibly before the end of this week. So those are some of the headlines that we're continuing to follow here on Political Update on Atlanta News First. Encourage all of you to watch and listen to all of our podcasts on YouTube, as well as download Political Update and all of Atlanta News First podcasts, Decatur Dish, Behind the Investigation, and others, wherever you listen to your favorite podcast on your favorite podcasting platform. From my friend Rick Folbaum, I'm Tim Darnell. Thanks for watching and listening to this edition of Political Update here on Atlanta News First and AtlantaNewsFirst.com.